by Gmeet itself, but right now I'm recording from not directly from Gmeet. Okay, so that is why.
So, perhaps you are using a different, platform,
Yes, sir.
because they didn't allow me to enter through my registered mail. I allowed enter through another mail. Because they are saying that your access is denied. Normally, the mail where it comes.
I don't know.
So the registered.
Uh, this link was created by Diproda, and
Okay.
there is no permission required. I don't know why, and people are just
I don't know
getting
why they are
into.
there. Okay, okay, okay. Okay.
Okay. So I'm starting what I hope will be the last in the series. It's been a long journey, and there have been very few friends. Mr. PSG and Madhusudan London have been with us throughout, and sometimes Raj Saden, and of course Dikro has always been with us. But today I don't think I'll be very coherent. I'll try as far as possible, because my friends and I, we are going through a deep personal tragedy. We cannot repeat it. So yeah, I started just now. So can you see the slide? Can you see the slide?
Yes, sir.
Yes, can the slide be seen?
Yes, yes, it can be seen now. Yes, it is.
Yes, yes, sir. We can see the
So,
slide.
so just to recapitulate what we had discussed in our last lecture and define the scope of this lecture, we had started a rather cursory discussion about the new directions along which Marxism has developed since the time of Marx. We were particularly discussing the questions of agency and the possibilities, limitations, and varieties in the interpretation of class as a category in this context. We also discussed the issue of organizing order in the individual psychic makeup as well as in the society. That is, we said that we have been using the discursive framework of overdetermination, where we know that we are all as individuals pulled and pushed in various directions by various influences, political, personal, familial, etc., economic. And then how do we organize ourselves? That is, why is it that we don't, our psychic structure doesn't break up in the, normally we are psychologically stable. There are, of course, situations where it may break up. So why is it that the psychic structure is stable? And similarly, it can be parallelly, it can be argued that the social structure itself is also stable, and what makes for the psychic structures breakup can also make for the society's breakup. For this, we relied on the concept of hegemony that was derived from the embryonic statement in German ideology of Marx and its elaboration as a theoretical process by Gramsci and later Laclau. We discussed in this context the significance of empty signifier of Laclau. We have seen that words to which different meanings can be attached, concepts to which different meanings, like liberty, equality, fraternity. Such are the hegemonic signifiers, which we call NP signifiers, because different people can attach different meaning, but different groups of people can attach different groups of group meanings to it. So we discussed in this context the significance of empty signifier of Laclau, or what is more commonly referred to as floating signifiers, for constructing the chains of equivalence between different people's movements. Laclau says that this is the way in which the movements, different kinds of movements, can be strung together to create a mass a chain of mass movements by using floating signifiers. That was the hypothesis, and so we discussed this. We would today discuss other directions in which Marxist theory has developed, in particular the geopolitical direction. will start today's discussion, however, by taking up a point that was raised by Professor Pranab Basu in the course of our last discussion. I think this is an important point. I have mentioned Mao's contribution to the discursive structure that we are using, overdetermination. In a much earlier lecture, we have referred to it because Althusser really uses overdetermination and contradiction. Contradiction is an idea borrowed from Mao, which he openly admits, and overdetermination is, of course, something which is borrowed from psychology. Now, so contradiction, this was a point again raised by Professor Pranab Basu. We'll discuss it because I think it is significant, the questions that he asked. I don't know whether he's present today. He had queried whether such chains of equivalence that Laclau talks of can or must necessarily be constructed. Whether the only way in which one can organize the different movements together, we can string them together, is to construct chains of equivalence, as Laclau suggests, and whether Mao's concept of principal and non-principal contradictions may not be more useful. He had raised the question in the particular context of the class versus Dalit oppression question, citing a Dalit position that favors market liberalization as a tool of empowerment through the spread of capital, which presumably favors meritocracy. Now, this is not a new question, it's an old question also, because Ambedkar himself was a very modern person. So the introduction of modernity, the flowering of liberalism, and now neoliberalism, that is something which we as leftists, we critique liberalism and we critique neoliberalism. In what sense we have discussed in detail. Now, on the other hand, the Dalit, the excluded groups in any society, they aspire to the equality of liberalism. Just a second. I'm sorry, I was interrupted. He had raised the question in the particular context of the class versus Dalit oppression question, citing a Dalit position. We know that the Dalit position questions the leftist position, which is always critical of capitalism of the market, because the Dalit position is that capitalism favors meritocracy, in which the exclusion, that is, it is in a sense political emancipation. It also cited the instance of the early celebration of the victory, yearly celebration of the victory of East India Company forces, a large part of which consisted of low-caste Mahars over the Peshwa on 1st January 1818. That was the victory, that was the fight which was, Koregaon, Bhima Koregaon, we know it as the incident, and so many people were arrested when it was being celebrated in 2020. Now, this is actually the celebration of a victory of the East India Company over the Peshwa, but it is celebrated by the Dalits because a large part of the East India Company forces consist of low-caste Mahars. Also, the question of Jayadeen mobilization, which is often dismissive of the left for being insensitive to the Dalit question. We find Mao Zedong's position on this issue, that is on the issue of creating a coherence between different movements of different oppressed peoples. We find Mao's position on this issue on contradictions in the selected works of Mao Zedong, Volume 1, and on the correct handling of contradictions among the people is in Volume 5. Professor Pranab Basu is right in pointing out that principal and non-principal contradictions, this is something which categories, the two categories which Mao uses, contradiction scheme may be used to build a discursive space that allows us to think the relation between the different people's movements as well as the class movements differently from the hegemony chain of equivalence scheme. So Mao talks about the different contradictions existing within a society and creating forces which may either work in favor of status quo or work against it. And these contradictions, he divides them into the principal and the non-principal contradiction. Now, there is my only reservation is that, like most of Mao's formulations, is more contextual and polemical than categorical. I just mentioned this in passing. Now, even if you ask the question, what is a principle and a non-principle, how do you differentiate between these contradictions? Like in a capitalist society, it's very clear that the principal contradiction is between the working class and capitalist class. Whereas in China, which he calls semi-feudal, there is, he says it's a very complex situation. Now, how do you determine what is a principal contradiction? There doesn't seem to be a theoretical answer to this because, like most of Mao's formulations I have mentioned, they're contextual and polemical. He says, for example, he says that the principal contradiction may change. For example, when Japan launched a war against the invaded China, the principal contradiction changed, and Kuomintang, which was not allied with the left, they were allied with the nationalist forces in order to resist the Japanese. So the principal contradiction itself may change. The hegemonic space is based on the understated, that is the hegemonic space that is narrated by Laclau, is based on the understated idea of domination of one aspect of a particular contradiction, say working class position over all other contradictions. Now, hegemony, as Laclau and Gramsci is of course quite clear about this, that, and also Marx, that the ruling class must dominate the culture, and if a class aspires to overthrow the ruling class, it must itself be able to dominate the culture of the majority of the people. This is what Marx states, and this is the idea that Gramsci also uses. Now, Laclau, of course, says that the chain of equivalence, it is not very certain that who is going to introduce this chain of equivalence, but underlying this is the idea that the revolutionary forces are going to combine all the movements, the environmental movement, the gender movement, the feminist movement, etc., everything together with the working class, by the use of these floating signifiers. For the individual psyche, the parallel process is the domination of, say, the feminist position, which we had discussed. Mao's work suggests an openness, particularly in the case of complex societies like Chinese society, on the eve of the revolution as opposed to the Western societies. This is just a reading of Mao, and the same essays have passages that suggest different readings. For example, when he talks of principal and non-principal contradictions in the essay on contradiction, he uses a formulation which is almost similar to, in certain places, he uses a formulation which is almost similar to the base superstructure, that the non-principal contradictions are derivative of the principal contradiction. But in other places, it is different, and I am not using that kind of derivation. So I'm saying this is just one reading of Marx, just as what I presented as Marx is one reading of Marx. Now, this is a quotation from On Contradictions. There are many contradictions in the course of development of any major thing. He talks of physical things as well as social situations, social relations. There are many contradictions in the course of development of any major thing. These contradictions cannot be treated in the same way, since each has its own particularity. And this is the significance of this is significantly different from what Laclau says, that we have to understand the particularity of each contradiction, the particularity of each movement. We who are engaged in the Chinese Revolution must not only understand the particularity of these contradictions in their totality, that is, how they are held together, that is, in their interconnections, but also study the two aspects of each contradiction as the only means of understanding the totality. Two aspects mean, for example, if we say the feudal contradiction, two aspects will be the serf and the feudal lord. If we say two aspects of the feminist contradiction, it will be the patriarchal position versus the feminist position, for example. So we have to, that is in their interconnect. We who are engaged in the Chinese Revolution must not only understand the particularity of these contradictions in their totality, that is in their interconnections, but also study the two aspects of each contradiction as the only means of understanding the totality. Now, that can be used in the case of the Bhima Koregaon case that we were talking about and which Professor Pranab Basu raised. Bhima Koregaon, so if we say that these, each aspect of a contradiction must be studied separately, that we get to the point that Bhima Koregaon is not to be treated as just the victory of British over the Peshwas. The native soldiers who fought for the British are not to be treated as just British soldiers. And the Peshwas are not to be treated as just representatives of Indians fighting the British. So the native soldiers, the Mahars, were not only fighting for the British, but they were fighting against the Peshwas, and that is why they celebrate. So they have a dual character which can only be uncovered by studying this contradiction in both its aspects. On one side, the Peshwas; on the other side, the East India Company soldiers. So, and the Peshwas are not to be treated as just representatives of the Indians, as nowadays the patriotic films make them to be, but they were also the oppressors of the Mahas. The flexibility of this approach is further indicated by his claim, Mao's claim that, and I quote, in a semi-colonial country such as China, the relationship between the principal and the non-principal contradictions presents a complicated picture, close quote, as compared to the capitalist countries where the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is clearly the principal contradiction and the non-principal contradictions derive from them. As in much of Mao's statements, this is clearly indexed. This just indicates, it is indicating that this is, in Chinese situation is different. But this does not indicate that he does not go into further analysis regarding the difference in situation. Why is China different from West? Why are the relations between the non-principal contradictions and the principal contradictions different in China compared to the West? That he does not go into. But this does indicate that a class contradiction may not necessarily be the principal contradiction. It could be caste. So it could be because of the complexity. One can say that because, as he's saying in China, so also in India, the question that Professor Basu was raising, that why is it that the Dalit organizations are skeptical of the leftists? So the leftists think that always in terms of the class situation, but in certain situations it may be the fundamental contradiction may be between the Dalits and the Brahminical society. He also gives certain examples of changes in principal contradiction in China on account of change in historical circumstances. So if we take the parallel situation, it may be that today with the spread of Hindutva, the principal contradiction has changed, and that is why the alliances, the nature of the alliances, political alliances in the representative elections, they are also changing. So in that sense, Mao's reading, Mao's own contradictions may provide a different route through which we can understand the relations or build the relations between the different movements. Now, this is through the reading of Mao and the correct handling of contradictions. The difference between the hegemonic tactics of insinuating a floating signifier to construct a chain of equivalence and Mao's prescription for correct handling of contradictions comes through clearly in this quotation. So, on the one hand, we have the position that supposedly is derived from Gramsci's concept of hegemony, which says that a hegemonic situation can be created by using floating signifiers, like the capitalists, the bourgeoisie used one at a time through the floating signifiers of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So, similarly, one can think of, it is not mentioned what could be the floating signifiers, because of course it is different in different geographical regions. So, but Mao's prescription is quite different for handling this relation between the different contradictions. And I quote, since they are different in nature, the contradictions between ourselves and the enemy. The enemy. Again, this enemy is not defined theoretically. If we take, for example, all the oppressors on one side, all the repressors on one side, and all the exploiters on one side, and all the oppressed, the repressed, and the exploited on the other side, then we could say that the oppressors, repressors, and the exploiters constitute the totality of the enemy. And the people are the oppressed, the repressed, or the exploited. Since they are different in nature, the contradictions between ourselves and the enemy, and the contradictions among the people, that is ourselves, must be resolved by different methods. To put it briefly, the former, that is between ourselves and the enemy, entail a drawing a clear distinction between ourselves and the enemy, and the latter entails drawing a clear distinction between right and wrong. Drawing the line refers to antagonistic relation of conflict. So, when you say that the relation between the enemy and ourselves, drawing the line, so that how is this relation to be defined by drawing a line? That is dividing the two. There is no connection. So, it is a confrontational line. We stand on two sides of a barrier. Drawing of the line refers to an antagonistic nature of conflict that cannot be settled through democratic unity, but through conflict. Where will it be drawn? There is no theoretical answer. But historical examples indicate that it is not just a class character of society that distinguishes the people from the enemy. So as I was saying, that it is, these are not class relations, repression, oppression, these are not class relations, exploitation is. But the repressed, the oppressed, the exploited would constitute the people, whereas the enemy would be the repressor, the oppressor, and the exploiter. So the Brahminical side, the Brahmins, the capitalists, the feudal, the aristocracy, all would be on the side of the enemy. And the Dalits, the females, the working class, the peasants would all be on the side of the people. So, regarding the handling of contradictions among the people, for example, caste and class, the position is clear. This, again I quote, this democratic method of resolving contradictions among the people was epitomized in 1942 in the formula unity, racism, unity. So you start with the unity of the people because you have defined the people, so there is a certain unity. That is, they are defined in opposition to the enemy. To elaborate, that means starting from the desire for unity, because you are fighting the enemy. You are starting with the desire. For example, in our question of electoral politics, we are starting with the desire to defeat what the opposition thinks is a fascist regime, resolving contradictions to criticism or struggle. That is, within the oppositional parties, conglomerations, that there are differences, contradictions. So this is to be resolved, criticism or struggle, and arriving at a new unity on a new basis. So the people, they are not to be dominated, they were not to be hegemonized by any segment of the people themselves, be it class, be it the working class, not to be hegemonized by them through the deployment of floating signifiers, but rather all the different segments of the people are to constitute a higher unity through the democratic process of unitarianism and unity. And so that is about the questions that were raised in the previous, which I thought that we need to elaborate. Now moving on, a new direction in which Marxian developed is the question of geopolitics. The Communist Manifesto ends with a stirring call, working men of all countries unite. But this has been one of the least successful of all the messages in the manifesto. The position was that capitalism would spread globally, and the only significant conflict would be between labor and capital that would assume global proportions. What has happened instead, since the beginning of the 20th century, is increasing conflict between capitalist nations. This has been complemented by the struggle to colonize nations for the benefit of national capital. This imperialist struggle for colonies was encapsulated in Lenin's formula, imperialism as the highest stage of capital. The situation is now complicated by the presence of transnational companies. MNCs, multinational companies, that is, companies that derive large part of their revenue from overseas operations, are old. For example, the East India Company. The TNCs are different in the sense that they are not geocentric. Modern MNCs like TNCs have foreign subsidiaries, but these are centrally managed by the parent company. The subsidiaries of transnational companies, however, are managed locally where they are centered. If they are centered in India, they will be managed by Hyundai. India will be managed by India. The structure of capital, therefore, does not even approximate to the national capitals, as Lenin saw in his times. In fact, there is a body of opinion, flawed though it may be, that suggests that nation states are no longer necessary for capital. We shall try to take up these issues. Imperialism is essentially the idea that the world contains an undesirable hierarchy of nations in which some oppress or exploit others or strive to do so. This I'm going, I will give you the quotation in subtly, Bob subtly, I will give you the references. Imperialism is essentially the idea that the world contains an undesirable hierarchy of nations in which some oppress or exploit others or strive to do so. Marx discussed the issue sporadically, that is, in bits and pieces. He took inconsistent positions on the question of the effects of imperialism on the colonies. He clearly expected and hoped that capitalist colonialism would develop India, though he noted that it had underdeveloped Ireland, and expressed grave doubts about whether it could or should develop Russia. So he took different positions with regard to different geographical territories. Perhaps the earliest theory linking capitalist structure to imperialism is that of Rosa Luxemburg. She argued in Accumulation of Capital that, according to Marx's scheme, a part of the value produced during any circuit of capital only partly accrues to the customer. That is, to the labor, because the labor is consumes, the capitalist saves. Only a partly accrues to consumer labor. This is, the rest is surplus value. Hence, total value produced cannot be consumed because surplus value is not consumed. So, the total value produced cannot be consumed. Underconsumption cannot be overcome without imperialist output. This is Rosa Luxemburg's position. This would lead to absorption of pre-capitalist production forms into the circuit of capital. If there is imperialist occupation, pre-capitalist forms would be absorbed into the circuit of capital. Take raw materials, sell capitalist goods in the colonies. It would be absorbed in the circuit of capital by the destructive advance of capital. The colonies would become suppliers of materials and men released by the destruction of their production conditions. They would then become buyers of the surplus products of imperial countries. So, like what happened in India, our industries were destroyed, our cotton industry was destroyed, and we became importers of calico. But destruction of the productive ability and export of labor would act as barrier to the colonies functioning as market for surplus products of imperial nations. Thus, capitalism would fail. This is what she argues, that once you break down internal production and you extract the surplus from here, so there would be less money to buy the goods produced by the capitalist countries. So this would not be able to act as a market which would stop overcome the crisis of underconsumption. It is a predecessor of current, but destruction. So thus capitalism would break down. This is a predecessor of current theories like that of Harvey, David Harvey, that sees primitive accumulation as an adjunct of capitalist structure rather than a prior stage. Now, when Marx discussed primitive accumulation, it was seen as a prior stage, but if we follow the theory of Luxemburg, then she said that primitive accumulation always have to go on to provide a market for the surplus goods. And this is a position which we will not discuss Harvey's position. That is why Harvey does not call this primitive accumulation, he calls it accumulation by dispossession. Luxemburg, however, oversimplifies. If capitalists keep spending surplus value, keep spending surplus value through expansion, the crisis will not follow. So it is true that the capitalist does not consume, but the surplus value, what will it be used for? If it is used for expansion of capital, then it will create a market for goods, so there should be no crisis. The problem is that they invest in anticipation of demand, and somewhere down the line, under consumption must become a factor. So they will invest, but sometimes the capital may be withdrawn from the circuit. Why? Because there is anticipation there will not be sufficient market. So the problem is that they invest in anticipation of demand, and somewhere down the line, under consumption must become a barrier. Lenin initiated the first major Marxist intervention into the theory of imperialism. The context was the question of whether the workers ought to support their respective nations in the international conflict. That is the World War I. He argued that the war was an imperialist war between states fought for grabbing global markets in the interests of monopoly capital based in their respective countries. Hence, the war should be opposed by the workers. A notable difference with Luxemburg is Lenin sees imperialism as resulting from the growth of monopolies and not inherent to capitalism. According to him, so Luxemburg had seen imperialism as something which is inherent to capitalism. It's not as if it is created by the growth of capitalism to a certain limit where it becomes monopolistic. That is what Lenin sees. Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism when it becomes monopoly. According to Lenin, there are imperialism has 5 distinct markers. There's concentration and centralization of capital, which plays a decisive role in the economy and state. Concentration and centralization. That is, on the one hand, capital starts growing by itself. Some efficient capital keeps growing while the others go out of business. And also, there is this tendency that during crisis, during a downdraft of the cycle, the small capitalist is unable to survive without a cushion of capital, which can reserve capital, which can help it tide over the crisis. So then it is swallowed by large capital. So concentration and centralization plays a decisive role in the birth of monopoly and in the economy and the state. The merger of finance capital and industrial capitalist interests. He says that finance capital starts because finance capital has larger entities and smaller number. They start gobbling up the industrial capitalists, and this also leads to the growth of monopoly. Export of capital replaces the export of commodities because capital is not finding any outlet for investment. Because when it becomes monopoly, when it is competitive, investment is large because each is trying to compete against the other, expand its scale of production. But when it becomes monopoly, you don't try to expand your scale of production to take advantage of expanding markets. Rather, you try to increase prices and take advantage of expanding market. So then you search for other spheres of investment, and he's saying there's export of capital replaces export of commodities. And formation of international capitalist monopolies that share the world among themselves. So this is the imperialist wars leading to alliances which break up the underdeveloped country, what we now know as the underdeveloped countries, into the colonies or neo-colonies, which serve as markets for capitalist production in the monopoly capitalist production, and also provide the raw materials. The territorial division of the whole world among the greatest capitalist powers is complete. Lenin's views did have errors. There was little export of capital. Lenin argued when he was building on the data and the analysis of someone called Hobson. Now, later data shows that there was very little export of capital. In colonies like India, what was invested was part of what was extracted as colonial plunder. So what was taken from our country in the form of land revenue, only a part of this was reinvested in India. So it was not as if there was an export of capital from Britain to India. Control of finance capital over productive capital is also not substantiated by data. Now, what was the impact on the colonies, or what we now refer to as the Third World? Marx, Lenin, Hilferding, Luxemburg, and all early Marxist theories of imperialism seem to suggest generally that imperialism would generate capitalist growth and progress in the colonies. Later, neo-Marxist ECLEs, that is the Economic Council for Latin America, UNCTAD, United Nations Council for Trade and Development, argued that imperialism and later neo-imperialism, that is imperialism working to death without formal political subjugation, causes retardation of growth in the third world countries. So, underdevelopment of the new colonies would bring, being the complement of capitalist development. So, development creating underdevelopment. Now, how does development create underdevelopment? There have been various theories. One is the theory which is very popular in the 70s, the unequal exchange theory. That is, this argues that unlike the initial position in capital, that all commodities exchange at values, there is an unequal exchange between the underdeveloped countries and the developed countries. What the value of what is exported by the developing country to the developed country is more than the value of what the developed countries export to the underdeveloped countries. This is argued in various ways. One simple way in which it is argued is that the wages are lower in the underdeveloped countries. That is, B is what is considered to be the necessary subsistence is lower, D is lower, and the rate of surplus value, of course, is equalized, and therefore the total value of goods exported from the third world countries or the underdeveloped countries would be lower than what would be higher. Then there's a question of debt bondage. That is, this works mainly through the IMF and other international bodies who give debts, and then there are the conditionalities imposed on the third world countries. Then the terms of trade, this has been argued by, particularly by Latin America, showing historical data, that whenever trade is open, the terms of trade turn against the underdeveloped countries, and this causes a deterioration in their growth rate. Then there is destructive of domestic productive potential through surplus drain in positions and the role of international economic organizations. This is argued in great detail by Sweezy, I'm not being able to open it. And the new international division of labor, that is, there is putting out of the more labor-intensive products, the sweatshops producing goods for branded garment manufacturers, for example. So there is a new division of labor where parts of the productive process are put out to the third world countries, and these are the parts which require little mechanization, little machinery, and more of labor, which is undertake. Then there's export of polluting industries, because the laws regarding environmental pollution in the Western countries is stricter than in the poorer countries. Then there's unequal impact of pollution controls. That is, the first world countries are polluted and grown, and now the imposition of pollution controls is impacting the growth of the third world countries. There's a view that the growth of TNCs, as we just mentioned, as opposed to MNCs, has rendered the state irrelevant to capital. TNCs differ from MNCs in the sense that overseas subsidiaries of TNCs are registered in their local countries and have large, if not entire, autonomy of decision. Thus, it is argued they are not geocentric. So, the question of imperialism as such does not arise. It is argued that the 400 largest such companies own more of the Earth's resources than the nation states together, and they are responsible for almost half of the world's trade. The extreme version of this view argues that conflict between nations has been displaced into the conflict between classes. TNCs no longer require the patronage of their country of origin, so imperialism is irrelevant. So it doesn't require the state, the patronage of the state. So the conflict is now directly between the classes. The state doesn't come into this conflict. Opponents argue first that the economic predominance of large companies in the world is not unprecedented. This happened in the previous periods also. The top management of subsidiaries comes largely from the originating party, even if they are TNCs. They still rely on the nations of origin to defend their interests. Whenever suppose a TNC in India, Hyundai India, say, there is a nationalistic government which imposes restrictions on this TNCs, increase the tax rate on foreign capital. In that case, the states of their origin step in to ensure that the interest of the TNCs is not hampered. They still rely on the nations of origin to defend their interests. These latter arguments are largely valid, as countless episodic examples would suggest. The Iraq war was fought without international sanction on trumped-up grounds for the interests of oil conglomerates. You see, Iraq war was fought first because it was claimed that there were weapons of mass destruction. When the war ended, no such weapons of mass destruction were uncovered. So it was fought purely in favor for oil conglomerates refused to bow down to these oil conglomerates. Similarly, Adani and the accompanied PM Modi as part of the entourage. In today's papers also you find that it's coming from criticism by the Financial Times. Of course, capitalists do accompany their prime ministers on foreign tours. But in this particular case, every time that Adani's accompanied Modi, they were executing deals in which the state was involved. It was not a capitalist to capitalist argument. It was for defense, it was for ports, etc. Now, so this is without the help of the state, such could not have been achieved. So the argument that with growth of TNCs, there is no necessity of the state, they don't rely on the state, this is not supported by evidence. Now, I'm coming to the end of this series. I think today has been rather unstructured delivery, however. The overdetermination approach, I'm just summing up, approach to Marxism argues that Marxism is class focused. Thus, its major goal is economic emancipation, but its ultimate goal is human emancipation. Some interpretations mistakenly assume that the latter is a function of the former, that is, human emancipation can be caused by economic emancipation. as we have discussed. The reality is that human emancipation requires continuous and endless struggle in many directions. And this is human emancipation never really achieved. So these struggles must keep going on. Some of these are revealed in the new social movements like gender-based, environmental, ethnic, and poor people's movements. Probably because of the hangover from the reductionist reading of Marx, Marxists tend to introduce a class angle into these issues and, where not possible, dismiss the movements as divisive. So this is something which, for example, as was pointed out in our previous lecture, the Dalits resent. Women's issue is reduced to exploitation of household labor. So this is how the Marxists view the women's issue is household labor is exploited, women's labor comes in for feudal exploitation. And this is how the women's issue is reduced into a question of an economics. Social identity and recognition issues are treated as issues of economic neglect, are opposed as conspiracies to break working class unity. Environmental degradation is reduced to the impact of capitalist capacity, etc. But we know now that even the socialist countries, they have not paid any heed to environmental problems. While the class-based interpretations may be somewhat relevant, may be sometimes relevant, it is necessary to recognize the relative autonomy of these issues, requiring a specific oppositional movements, and this is what Mao really talks about. There is no reason for Marxists to be dismissive of such autonomous social movements, because the ultimate aim of Marxism is human emancipation, and within an overdetermined social space, there is no essential reason for various deprivations and repressions. The effort should not be to dominate or reject social or people's movements, but to participate and try to search for empty signifiers that will unite the movements through a process of unity, preserve unity. So that again, and this is the set of references. You'll find it on YouTube. If you look it up, you will find it. So
anyone have, thank you Pranabda for such an important lecture. Anyone having question? Yeah, Professor Pranab Basu, kindly.
Professor.
Pranabda, thank you very much for addressing my questions. I have just two questions. One is that when we are talking about imperialism, what happens when we look into the new phenomena like growth of, just 1 second, like the growth of, say, the service sectors and also the share market. In case of share market, we know that millions of people, they purchase share, and thus they become kind of owners of the means of production, owners of capital. So there is a kind of fragmentation of capital. It is not the classical type of ownership of over capital, what we found during the days of industrial capitalism. But in case of share market, we find that decentralization of ownership has taken place on a wide scale. So, how do we distinguish between the owner of capital and the non-owning class of capital? And the laborer at the same time can purchase shares of capital, so a large section of the laborer or worker, they become at the same time owners of capital. I find this very confusing, and the old classical Marxist theory can hardly explain this situation. At least I don't understand it. Maybe I need some more elaboration from your side.
Okay.
That is the first thing. Second thing is that when you are talking about Mao Zedong's own contradiction, uh, Mao, so far I have gone through this article. Uh, as far as I have understood, Mao as an orthodox Marxist, he is focusing on the base, the economic exploitation, dimension of economic exploitation. And he is not paying any attention to superstructural dimensions of domination or oppression. So when he is talking about principal contradiction and non-principal contradiction, all of them, both of them he is talking about, they belong to the base, they belong to the economic, the dimension of economic exploitation. But the identity politics or religious minority or Dalit question or gender question, environmental question, these largely belong to the superstructural dimension. And Mao's contradiction, his article does not consider these non-base, non-economic exploitation. That was what I understood when I went through the article. So, how are we going to apply Mao's contradiction, theory of contradiction, in case of the identity politics, in case of gender or environment or Dalit question? And moreover, when we talk about the principal contradiction, uh, when Mao talks about the contradiction, agrarian contradiction or feudal contradiction as principal contradiction, and he described how it uh, changes to how the principal contradiction becomes the anti-Japanese aggression. Uh, at that time, certainly principal contradiction changed. But I just want your, maybe it is a third question. Since I am confused, I want your suggestion that uh, what is the relative position of immediate contradiction and principal contradiction or total contradiction. For example, suppose lot of people are today talking about resistance to the corrupted autocratic regional government of Trinamool Congress. Since the people of West Bengal are finding TMC as their immediate enemy, so they want to concentrate on that. And I have seen a lot of CPM friends, CPIM friends, they also say that Trinamool Congress is the immediate enemy and BJP is not our immediate enemy since BJP is not in power in West Bengal. So we should concentrate our main struggle, main target of TMC. On the other hand, if we apply the Marxist view about the totality, contradiction on a total scale, then we have to assess the role of BJP in India as a whole. And if we consider that, we will find that BJP is tending to a fascist government, and this fascism should be considered as the principal enemy. So, Trinamool corruptions may be considered as secondary, but BJP is to be considered as the principal enemy. Now, my specific question is that immediate enemy and total systemic enemy, which one is the principal enemy?
I'm not sure I've been able to retain all the things, because as I said at the beginning of the lecture today, I'm really disturbed. But first of all, I think the first question related to shareholding capital as opposed to partnership or single ownership firms. which was there traditionally. But of course, when Marx was writing shareholding, stockholding had in mind. Now, the dispersed shareholders, they really do not constitute a body of owners in the sense of the capitalists. Now, you see, just a technical detail, for example, that the small shareholder, suppose that you own some share in some company. What is the entitlement of the shareholder? That shareholder is entitled to dividend, is entitled to attend the annual general body meeting, and is entitled to vote on the board of directors. And when the notice for the meeting, annual meeting, general body meeting is issued, together with that, the shareholder also receives what is called a proxy form. What is this proxy form? If you sign the proxy form, you say that I am not going to attend the general body meeting. So you can, the existing own, you are giving your vote to the, you are giving up your vote to the existing management. Now, I don't recollect the exact year, but it was when George Fernandez was a minister. There was this controversy regarding the nationalization of Tisco. There was a move to nationalize, at least it was said in Parliament that the government was planning to nationalize Tata Iron Steel Company. Now, at that point of time, Tisco, the Tata management, they published a white paper in which they showed that they only owned something like 13% of the total stock of Tisco. And the question they raised was the government with something like 33%, including the public sector banks and LIC, etc., IDBI. With 33% shareholding, it could well introduce any policy change that it wanted. So what was this question of nationalization, which was a valid point, you see. So what this joint stock company, the introduction of the idea of the joint stock company, what it has done, why has the joint stock emerged? It is because the Adanis then can control a much larger amount of capital than they actually have. So it is not as if the small shareholder is actually a capitalist in the sense that can take decisions, can influence decisions even regarding management. But the capital, my savings now becomes the capital of Adani. My savings now becomes the capital of Ambani or Tata or whoever. So actually, this is just like they borrow money from the banks and leverage that. What the term is leverage. So you have a small amount of capital and you build it up into a very large capital through these instruments. So in that sense, there is not a. In fact, this is helping the capitalist class. This is not a dispersion of the capitalist class, as I would say. The second point was on contradiction. No? The second point was on contradiction.
Contradiction. Now talked about contradiction.
Oh, yes.
At the level of base, not at the level of superstructure.
As I was mentioning that if one reads on contradictions or if one reads matter more, the same thing happens. He is full of praises for the formulations of Stalin also, which of course Lenin and Stalin, which of course then he elaborates also that the economics is what he says the principal contradiction determines the non-principal contradiction, which is really the same as the base superstructure metaphor. Now, as I mentioned in my lecture also, so I'm just trying to appropriate bits from Mao and suit it to our needs. And I said that this is a reading of Mao. Of course, this is not the reading of Mao, and I quite agree that you can find so many quotations from both that essay on contradiction, or you take any other essay which poses to be theoretical in nature, and you can sustain this argument that he believes in the base superstructure metaphor, and so in that case, the superstructural, if you use the metaphor, we don't of course use that metaphor. If you use that metaphor, then what these superstructural contradictions or superstructural movements, gender, then Dalit, those which relate not to exploitation but to repression and oppression, they become simply derivatives of this, and that is why the Jai Bhim, the Bhim party, finds the leftists dismissive. Nah? Because the leftists think that, well, and then Indian leftists have this kind of attitude. That once you solve the class question, the class question will be solved by itself, which is of course an absurdity. So I agree with you, but what I was doing, I was trying to take parts of it and show the contrast with the idea of the chain of equivalence and hegemony, that one can build a theory through this principal and non-principal contradictions, use it to build an argument for a non-hegemonic front. Because what the leftists think about is always in terms of hegemonic, counter-hegemonic. There is hegemony by the ruling class, so you counter it with a mobilization which is counter-hegemonic. So I am imposing my hegemony. Left is imposing leftist hegemony on the Dalit movement, on the feminist movement. Now, and you will find a lot of leftist feminists. They are so much anti-minority movements. They are as much, I would say, liberal as the capitalists themselves. So that I grant that point, but what I was trying to do is to take up.
And lastly, what I said, that immediate enemy or total systemic enemy between these two. For example, immediate enemy TNC and total systemic enemy BJP. Which one should be considered as the greater enemy?
Now, you see, this is a value-loaded. There is no scientific or objective answer to this. This is a perception. My perception, of course, is that you see, this question of corruption. Now, I will try this to take up a long time. You see, this question of corruption, the what we say, the degeneration of democracy. Now, these are arguments which are actually used to impose fascism. You see, our representatives are corrupt. So what we need is the people's power. And the people's power never comes about. So you have a representative of people's power. Who is that particular interest? Representing the people, the desires of the people, as opposed to the elected representative. So this is Trump saying that, well, I have lost an election, but so what? I represent the people. I represent the people. So this question of corruption, I'm not saying that corruption is good or corruption should not be should not be contested or fought against. Okay, but when you make it the only platform, anti-corruption, what you are doing is you are saying that, well, the representatives are corrupt, and so democracy itself is corrupt. It's almost comes like that, and then you say that then you need some strong person. So ultimately, and also this question of immediate and total systemic enemy. You see, when a lot of the left, particularly the CPIM, when they raise this bogey, I would say bogey, it is because of the fact that they are concerned with power at the level of the state. It's not an ideological. They have lost after 34 years. So go back land, lost to is very clearly lost to a lady who they perceive as less cultured than themselves. This is something which is difficult. This is a patriarchal position that they take. And I can give you so many examples of the arguments they give in a Vishwabharati, for example. There are 4 SFI students who have been suspended, and then the SFI leadership goes, and then they are given a hero's welcome by the existing administration, and they go and sign an agreement that saying that the expelled students will apologize unconditionally and they will be taken in. And the next day, the good court says that the charges against them are not proven, but already they have made that agreement that we have to extend unconditional apology. And in here, in the High Court, Vikas Bhattacharya argues that they will submit their unconditional apology. And there is a long story. So you see, this is what does this indicate? Who are you fighting? And the people who are on the ground fighting, you are not even standing beside them. The 4 SFI students were expelled. Where are you standing beside them? Where are you standing? So that I think is opportunism and part of the patriarchal hatred of a lady who is a chief minister.
Thank you very much.
Yes. If there are no further questions, I will thank everybody. Come to the end of the lecture series. I don't know how helpful it was to anybody. It was very helpful to me, the discussions. Maybe they helped me. And I think I will go through the lectures, revise them, and see sometimes it may come out in a good form. Thank you all. Good night. See you sometimes.
Kindly publish all these lectures in the form of a book.
Yes, I will try with some help from my students.
Yes.
Thank you, Pradeep.